Let's talk about one of the most important sword designs in Chinese and world history. The steel-bladed DAO, as seen here, that appeared in the Han Dynasty, was an incredibly important sword that came around 2,000 years ago, a little bit over that, probably around 100 BC. And it really took over as the primary military sword and became so for the next 800 years. Now, that's not to say that these stayed the same. I'll briefly just show another sword that will be coming up in a future video. But the DAO did develop and evolve into slightly different forms, slightly different shapes. But fundamentally, this basis of sword that came around just over 2,000 years ago was super important because it set the trend for Chinese swords for a long time to come and influenced lots of swords in other places as well, such as Japan and Korea. So the characteristics of this sword, as you will see here, is this is a relatively short example. We will, in another video, be looking at a longer example. So they did come in a variety of lengths, but this is the standard infantryman's DAO. And you'll see that it's a single-edged blade. And we'll talk a little bit more about the blade design because it's actually slightly more complex than it first appears. It's a single-edged blade. It's a one-handed length grip on this, although there were longer ones. There were ones with longer grips. And you'll notice this very characteristic ring pommel, or end, shall we say, whether you call it a pommel or not. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well. And this sword came about at a time when the jian, which we've looked at in previous videos, was the primary and had been for a long time the dominant military sword. Now, that's not to say that during the Han Dynasty there was a simple process of the jian being replaced by the DAO. Some people have said that in videos and various things you'll find on the internet. Some people will imply that the jian was the military sword and then the DAO came along and replaced it, and the jian became essentially just a civilian, ceremonial, courtly sword. And that's not really the case. There was a large and long overlap during which the jian was still a military sword, and equally, it wasn't the only sword used in courtly and civilian life. We also see the DAO became used by certain high-ranking officials, sometimes in preference to the jian. So both swords coexisted for a long period of time. And there is a relatively well-known document actually from an arsenal, that is a store of government weapons from the Han Dynasty, which actually lists the number of all the different weapons in the arsenal. And this is an invaluable source. And it actually shows that at that time there were just under 100,000 of those jian in the arsenal in storage, and there were 150,000 of these DAOs in storage. Which is very telling and very interesting. Now, obviously, the numbers we're talking about there are colossal, and it reminds us, of course, that Chinese armies at this time, relative to armies in lots of other parts of the world, were really big armies. It's obviously a very big area that they were sort of operating over, but also a very large number of people in those militaries and relatively large populations by world standards then as well. So it's clear that at that time there were a large number of jian, a large number of DAO. And how does that compare to the other weapons in storage, where they actually list different types of halberd, for example, and the types of halberd in storage are fewer than the number of either jian or DAO. So these swords were government produced, state controlled and kept in arsenals and issued out to soldiers as and when they were needed. So they were mass-produced weapons, but that's not to say that I think in the modern world we tend to assume that mass-produced equals poor quality, but in the ancient world very often mass-produced meant better quality, because something that was made at a state or government controlled foundry or manufacturing centre of weapons, for example, or anything else, armour or anything else, might be held to much higher standards than a locally produced weapon or armour might be. And we even see this in the 19th century to some extent as well, with the manufacture of sort of industrially produced weapons like sabres and bayonets and muskets and things like this. Sometimes they were better quality because they were held to a higher standard because the government wanted to ensure that they met certain criteria, whereas private ventures and private production and private purchase things weren't necessarily tested to the same rigorous standards. So these swords were extremely numerous in their time, and both the Jian, both the Dao existed at the same time in large numbers. So the real question is, before we go into looking at this specific sword, why? Why was it deemed necessary to add to the arsenals rather than just having hundreds of thousands of Jian in storage? Why was it deemed necessary to add such large numbers, in fact even larger numbers, 50% larger, of these Dao? Well, it's very clear that something happened during the Han Dynasty that meant that Daos became somehow preferable as military swords. There are some things we could talk about, the pluses and minuses and benefits of each of these designs, and we'll do that in a second. But from a government point of view, I think we can't ignore the fact that probably a very important motivation behind this is economics. Okay, how much it costs to make each of these weapons, potentially how durable they are, and you know, how complicated, what sort of resources it takes, or what rate you can produce them at. So quite simply, if I dispense with the scabbard for a minute and we compare these two swords, I also want to mention, just ignore the length difference between these, because of course this is a really quite long Jian and this is one of the shorter types of Dao, but there are long Dao that are as long as this Jian, and there are short Jian that are as short as this Dao. So ignore the length difference. We're just going to look at the fundamental design difference. So first of all, the blades. Well, obviously the main difference between this blade and this blade is that the Dao, the Han Dynasty Dao, is single-edged and it is relatively simpler to make. Okay, so it has a, just put the Jian down for a second, it has a thick back or spine to it, and it is fundamentally a wedge section. Although, I have to say, this particular example is a one-for-one replica of a surviving example, and it's more complex than you might think. So first of all, we'll assume that they're both made of the same material. In reality, these LK Chen replicas are made of the same material. They're both made of essentially pattern welded steel, two different types of steel, 1060 and I can't remember the other form of steel, a more modern alloy steel. And obviously they're made with modern production standards, modern heat treatment, that kind of thing. But in period, they also would have been made of the same kind of steel, although it wouldn't have been exactly the same kind of steel as these are made of. But if we look at the cross-section, for example, it is not a simple wedge. Okay, so first of all, you have a flat spine. Then you have a slightly tapering wedge section here, and then you have the final bevel to the edge. Okay, and this flat section isn't actually flat, it is actually hollow ground, so it actually has a very gentle fuller. Okay, so you've got overall the beginning of a wedge section, then you've got the final edge bevel, and adding to that, you've got distal taper. So this goes down from about 7 millimeters down to maybe about 4 millimeters. So this is tapered in several different directions. It's a relatively complex cross section actually for what, you know, you could make it more simple, but they've gone to the effort, and this is a one-for-one replica. They've gone to the efforts of making a relatively complex cross section that means that the weapon is really quite light for its size, even though it's relatively small as well. It's only about 400 and something grams. It's a really quite light sword. And in addition, you might also think that, well, this is straight and it's only got one edge. No, it's not. This is actually very slightly like a yataghan, slightly recurved. So actually, if we look along the blade, actually the blade comes forward and then does this. Okay, so it actually comes up and forward and then curves at the tip. So this is actually a pretty complex blade, despite the fact it looks initially very, very simple. And admittedly though, it's probably still less work to make than the Jian blade, because the Jian blade is double-edged, and double-edged swords are more work to make. Okay. So there's definitely an economic aspect here, but don't think that these are crude or simple blades. They're not, they're relatively complex, and they are also, at least to me, clearly the basis for certain types of other sword which develop later. I'll save this for another video in the future, but I'll just mention Japanese swords for example. Okay, now in terms of the hilts are very, very different, and I actually find this rather puzzling because we can explain the blade change, we can explain the introduction of these DAOs, and incidentally I'll just veer off for a second and just mention some people will go, well there were bronze sort of predecessors to this. Kind of, yes. I'm not going to go into the bronze single-edged swords that exist, but suffice to say that the Jian was the primary military sword up until the Han Dynasty, when the DAO came in as well. So let's ignore those for now. That's a complicated topic, and I don't think anyone fully understands how the exact evolution happened and how these came about. But these appeared predominantly in the Han Dynasty and then became very prevalent and in fact dominant. So we can accept that the blade, going back to the main topic, that we can accept that the blade changed because perhaps this single-edged type of blade is more economic to make, it's quicker to make, you can churn out bigger numbers of them. Even practicalities like the fact that this only has a single edge, so you've only got to maintain one good edge, you don't have to sharpen two edges. Perhaps it's a little bit more robust, perhaps it's less prone to damage, and that's very, very important if you're making weapons for the military. I've done videos in the past where I've demonstrated that government produced weapons, again if we come to the modern industrial age, if you look at even modern rifles, in fact, army rifles, or you look at Napoleonic era muskets, or you look at cavalry swords from the 19th century, they're often over-engineered and they're made bulkier and tougher than they necessarily need to be for a duelist, for a swordsman, but because they're being made for the military, they need to be durable, and that's very, very important. If you're funding and equipping and maintaining a military force, you want the weapons to be durable. So it's possible that they found that this type of blade, generally speaking, was less prone to bending or breaking and was just easier to maintain and cheaper to maintain. And I think that's quite likely, in fact. But there are some key differences between these two. Okay, fundamentally the grip's kind of similar on the outside, but I'll talk about the internals in a second. But the guards are clearly different. So the first thing we find with the DAO, introduction of the DAO, is we don't have such a notable or kind of clear to see guard. Okay, there is a sort of bolster or sort of hand stop on the DAO, but there's not very much to it, I have to say. And we'll talk about the use of this weapon in a second, but in terms of the hand sliding up, there isn't an awful lot to stop it. And there are some parallels there with things like yataghans, Ottoman yataghans, certain types of Afghan knives, things like the shashka, things like the sacks found in Germanic Europe. So there are some parallels with other types of swords and knives from the same period and from other periods that also don't really have much here to stop your hand slipping up. What does that tell us about usage? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. But the ring pommel is essentially welded on. It's an added on ring. It doesn't seem, although it may have been in some examples, but as far as I've seen from archaeological examples, it doesn't seem to have just been an extension of the tang which was bent around in a circle, which you'd think that would be an easy way to make it. Now, in terms of it was an added on loop, it was an added on element. Now, in terms of the construction of the hilt, very, very interesting. We come back here to durability again. So a jian is made very similar to a European sword in the sense that there is a tang running through here and a wooden grip is put around it, and then or some, I think usually put in two halves actually from either side, and the pommel is secured onto the bottom end, in this case usually with a rivet going through here. So there is a tang, a hidden tang essentially in the middle of the grip, middle of the wooden grip with a jian. And whilst that is sort of also true with the DAO, if you look at the archaeological examples where the organic material has gone, you can see that the tang is almost as broad, or sometimes exactly as broad, as the blade. Now that of course has a parallel with later Japanese swords. So famously the tang on katanas and tashi and wakizashi and tanto and things like this, they are almost as broad as the rest of the blade, which necessitates a different kind of hilt construction to what we normally see on European swords. Although, of course, we do have full width or almost full width tangs on some European swords like this Messer behind me and later patent hilts, for example. But what we can say is the DAO, that kind of adds to this idea that the Chinese DAO, the hand DAO, is very much strong, and I won't say indestructible, but a very, very resilient and tough weapon. It's got one simple edge. It's got a tang that's almost as thick as the blade. It's got a thick spine that's relatively inflexible. I mean, obviously it does flex because it's sprung steel, but it's stiff blade. So there's not very much that can go wrong with one of these weapons. And handling it and looking at it, I very much get the impression that these weapons were built for durability and toughness, rather than necessarily because they're the best sword design ever, or because they're necessarily more effective than a Jian. But I do get the impression that they are probably tougher and easier to maintain and less likely to fall apart than a Jian is. Now, that pommel. Why did they have ring pommels? Well, I don't know. I've mulled over this, and again, I don't have any answers, and I don't know anyone who does have any answers. One thing that is notable is that ring pommels enable you, and we see something like this even with Ottoman sources where they actually hold the grip of the yataghan, for example. But when you have a ring pommel, you are able to hang it off things, including your own fingers and thumbs, okay? So potentially you can tie things around that, you can loop it over things, you can hang it off things, and you can hang it off your own hand here. And if, for example, you were using a thumb ring and a thumb drawer with a bow, you could indeed have your sword hanging off your little finger and still use the thumb drawer with a bow, shoot your bow, and then if you need to, you can easily get your sword in your hand without having to unsheath it or reach anywhere else for it. So, and possibly this could even go for spears as well. If you were using, imagine a halberd or a two-handed spear, which we used a lot in the Han Dynasty. If you're using one of these weapons, you can keep hold of your ring-hilted dao like this whilst using your other weapon. Now, this isn't without its perils. If, for example, you were riding on a horse, okay, I'm not sure that I'd like the point of that sword dangling anywhere near me or the horse whilst I'm trying to shoot a bow and whilst I'm rocking around and moving around on a horse. Doesn't seem very safe to me. Equally, if I'm fighting with a spear on foot, I don't particularly think that I'd like this dangling around in my crotch and near my femoral artery and my legs and everything else. So I'm not sure that that was done usually or commonly, or that was even the reason that this was here. It may have been done, but that doesn't mean that's the reason that that ring pommel was there. So it does form a good hand stop to the hand sliding off. Now, let's talk a bit about how these swords were used. The first thing I always say in these videos, particularly for this era and China, is these swords, whether it's the Jian or the Dao, were intended to be used with shields, okay, predominantly. Now, yes, admittedly, there may have been courtiers, there may have been civilians who did use these swords by themselves. And indeed, we know that in dueling culture in China with the Jian, they sometimes use a type of buckler with hooks top and bottom. But generally speaking, in the military world, and I think the world that these swords were initially designed for, these were intended to be used with shields, most of them quite big shields, not as big as the Roman scutum, but some of them almost as long as a Roman scutum. They had oblong shields, they had some smaller shields, a variety of different sizes and shapes. Some of them gripped center gripped, possibly some of them gripped with strap N-arms or straps on the back, but the majority probably boss gripped. And you're talking about shields that vary from about that big for the most part up to maybe about that big. So not as big as a scutum, not as big as a pavis, medieval pavis, but as big as a medieval heater shield, for example. Some of them as big as a Norman shield, and some of them as small as some of the smaller heater shields, or even things like rotellas and things like this. So these were primarily intended to be used with shields of various types. Now, in terms of the hilt on the Royal Arsenal Dao here, which is repeat again, is a one-for-one replica of an original example. When we look at other swords and knives which don't have very much handguard here or hand stop, what we find is that those are predominantly cutting weapons, okay? Whether it's the Ottoman yataghan, whether it's the shashka, whether it's various types of swords and knife that you find in the kind of migration era as well, like the sacks. And even if we go all the way back to kind of Bronze Age and Iron Age weapons as well, it seems to be, generally speaking, that anything that doesn't have a good hand stop here is quite perilous to thrust with, but absolutely fine to hack and cut with, because of course when you hack or cut, your hand comes down this way, and indeed the ring pommel in that scenario, the ring pommel provides a really good stop to your hand coming off the back end. So one of the questions we have to ask, of course, and we have to ask ourselves is, and ponder is, was this basically just a cutting weapon? And I have to say, I don't think that it's, based on the evidence we've got, the shape of the tip, the shape of the hilt, the fact that there's no hand stop, I think we have to say there is actually a fairly decent argument to be made. I'm not going to say whether it's likely or even probable, but when we look at the design of the jian and look at the jian's tip, and then we look at the hand stop that you pretty much always have with the jian, okay, we can call it a guard, but really it's primarily there to stop your hand sliding up the blade. And we know that the jian was both used to cut and to thrust, but we know that it was used quite a lot to thrust. I'm not going to say that this weapon, at the end of the day, it's got a sharp point on it. I'm not going to say it wasn't used for thrusting, but it does seem to me that the design change that they went through, both in terms of the blade and in terms of the hilt, would suggest and would support someone arguing that it was a switch from thrust-centric, or at least thrust preference, to cut preference. And when you look at, if you just look at all the weapons in the world, or all the swords and knives in the world, and you compare it to this Chinese DAO, it does seem to me like it's primarily intended to be a cutting weapon. The fact that it's got that slight forward curve on this particular example, some are more straight. The fact that it's got a tip which is located at the back of the blade instead of a spear point in the middle like a jian has. The fact that you don't have a strong hand stop, and in fact on some later examples, I'll talk more about this in later videos, on some later examples like the hidden hilt one, there is no hand stop at all. I think this all leads us to believe that this was probably used principally quite similarly to the Ottoman yataghan or the Afghan chura or chara, which is primarily as a chopping and cutting weapon. So with a shield, I have to reiterate. So there we go, that's all supposition. We don't have very much source material, written source material at least. The artistic source material kind of shows that these were, we can't really tell. They were almost certainly used sometimes to stab, they were definitely used to cut. I get the sense that these were primarily cutting swords. Why did primarily cutting swords replace swords that were very well set up for thrusting as well as cutting? We don't know, okay? And did they replace the jian? Well, in a sense, yes. In military life, it does seem that certainly in the Han Dynasty, when these first appeared, there was a period of maybe 100, 200 years when these overlapped with the jian, and these were as numerous, where the jian was still as numerous as the DAO. But it does seem that as we get past into what in Europe would be the later Roman era, so once we get into maybe the 2nd, 3rd century, pretty much the DAO had taken over as a military sword. And it came, just to repeat as well, it came in different formats, not just this little one. Some have very long blades, some have slightly broader blades, some have different length hilts, some were potentially used two-handed, and they also have different rings. I'll just mention the ring once more, something else I'd like to mention kind of off the cuff, and we'll look at this later when we're looking at the hidden hilt DAO that I've got here also from LK Chen. But it is notable that the later design ones usually have really cool designs in the ring, and that by doing that, you cannot any longer get any of your digits through there. So I think for the people who assert, and I don't know if this is common, but some people assert that these were always sort of used to hang off a finger, or very often used to hang off a finger. I don't think that's necessarily something that persisted or was even common, because later designs of ring pommel have obstructions in the middle that prevent you from doing that. So it would suggest that these rings were either there for appearances, perhaps for ritual purposes, or just simply because it's a good way of stopping your hand slipping off the end without adding much weight. So it's a big round thing, but without the weight of something like a European wheel pommel. Right, so now we're going to look at the actual review of this sword. So breaking it down, I'll do this relatively briefly, I think. We're going to break this down into two parts. First of all, we're going to look at how is this one and its scabbard made, any constructional feedback from me, and secondly, we're going to do a little bit of cutting with it. Okay, so first of all, how is this made? Well, it's very nice. All of LK Chen's stuff is super nice. And I'm so happy that LK Chen is sending me this stuff because it gives me an excuse to learn more about Chinese weapons, to do videos about Chinese weapons, learn more about Chinese history, which I've always had an interest in, but I've not devoted as much time to in the past as I should have done. So it's giving me the chance to do that. But secondly, they're just really nice swords. I'm a really big fan of LK Chen's stuff. They are really good fun to wave around. They look pretty. And they're really nice to cut with. Now, some of the things I've said in the past about LK Chen swords, some of the constructional feedback, stand true of this one as well. And two of those things you will have heard me say before. So one of the things is that I find that the bronze fittings on this are just a little bit not sharp, but just a little bit too angular on some of the edges. This is particularly notable on this particular sword in two places. Number one, at the guard, if we'll call it that, or ferrule, hand stop. I find that these corners here, and I understand, I've got to caveat everything I say about this sword and the scabbard. This is a one-for-one replica of an original sword, so I can only criticize it to a certain point because a replica is a replica. It's replicating something, so it is based on an original. So there we go. But I would say personally that these corners and the edges are kind of okay here actually, but these corners, if they could just be rounded off a little bit more, I think that they would make it less likely to wear a blister or a hole in your hand when you're using it, if you're using it a lot. That's the first thing. Secondly, on the scabbard, we get a similar thing with the throat and with the chape down here. The chape, I have to be honest, is not fantastically well fitted to the end of the wooden scabbard. So I can get fingernails into those gaps, and there's a little bit of movement. So I can, if I wiggle this a little bit, I can move the chape a little bit on the wood. It doesn't really bother me, but obviously if you're spending your money on this, you should be aware of these kinds of things. There are some small cosmetic issues like this that you might get with these swords, but they are good value for money. They're not super expensive, and I have to say I think they're very well made for how much they cost. So I would say the bronze fittings, very nice, but if they could just be a little bit more rounded off, that's sanded basically on the edges and points, that would be good. Particularly on the back of this chape, I think if you were wearing this, say you were doing living history of Han Dynasty Chinese soldiers, I think you would want to sand those down, otherwise they're going to be constantly snagging on things on your clothes. So there we go, that's the one thing. And the second thing is about edge sharpness, which I've mentioned before. Now, this actually has very nice edge geometry, and of all of the, I've got quite a, I don't even know how many, I've got maybe like 8 swords from LK Chen now. The sharpness is a little bit of a lottery, it's a bit of luck. So their edge geometry is really, really good, fantastic, spot on, no criticisms. But the final sharpen is a little bit hit and miss, because obviously these are mass-produced things made in a workshop, in a factory, and sharpening is quite a fine thing, and it's very difficult for a mass manufacturer of anything to get sharpening 100% correct all the time. So some of you might buy 10 of these and you might find that 2 of them are super sharp, 2 of them are super blunt, and the other 6 are fine. And that's the sort of statistic I expect. Now, this blade is inconsistent along the edge. It's got good edge geometry, but not particularly sharp down there. It starts to get sharp here, but then it gets a little bit blunter again. And around this portion here, it's not super sharp. But then up here, ironically, well, not ironic, perfectly, where you're going to want to be cutting, it is actually really sharp. So the edge sharpness is a little bit inconsistent along the edge, and the edge sharpness on LK Chen swords can be a little bit inconsistent across individual swords that you might get. What I would add though is that I have sharpened this Gen. I have done a little bit of sharpening, extra sharpening myself on this. One downside of having a pattern welded etched blade is it makes you probably more reluctant to attempt sharpening because you don't want to mess up the pattern welding and the etch, which is understandable. But with some very fine polishing at the edge, you can bring up the edge to a really good level of sharpness. So it's not a big criticism, it's just something to be aware of. In terms of looking along the blade, you can see some rippling, but these are hand forged. That's historically accurate, I would think, and doesn't bother me at all, but there is some rippling. It's not perfectly flat. When swords are perfectly flat, they tend to have been ground, CNC'd a lot. These swords, I think, are predominantly forged and then probably not ground that much, is my guess, because you do see some rippling along. But that being said, the edge is absolutely perfectly true. There's no wobbling this way, and there's no twisting or warping like that, and the blade's perfectly straight. Looking along the spine, the blade, you can see ripples in the surface from the polishing, but there's no bends or twists or anything like that. In terms of the sort of fixtures and fittings of the hilt, everything's absolutely rock solid. There is wood under the grip, silk, black silk cord wrap over the top, done traditionally with this rather attractive sort of pattern of binding. Very, very nice, like that. Ring pommel welded on solidly, and you can just about see, I'll show you in here, you can just about see at the end of the ring pommel, you can see the wooden slats that come out of the end. So these are the wooden slats here coming up, which is, I think, ebony wood by the look of it, because I know the scabbards are ebony and it looks the same wood. So you've got hardwood slats either side of a tang. That's never going to break because that tang's massively thick, massively broad as the blade is. The polish, lovely. Okay, let's see if we can get that on camera. So you've got the pattern welded, come on camera, focus on that blade. There we go. So you can see the really, really nice pattern welding in there with a subtle etch. These blades originally probably would have been more laminated, so folded a lot of times. So you would have seen lines more than this almost water drop pattern. But then again, some of the originals might have had patterns like this, and I have seen a GN which was polished and re-etched, 2,000-year-old Gen, and that did have patterns not dissimilar to this. So yeah, I think one of the things LK Chen do really, really well are their polishes. It has the look of a hand polish, and the etch is subtle. It's not stark and kind of, you know, it's not, the acid isn't kind of giving any texture. It's really smooth and subtle and nice. Right, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at a little bit of cutting with this sword, and then some summing up after that. But overall, fascinating history to the Han Dynasty DAO, and I think super important as well in terms of where it sits in the history of Chinese swords. But let's see how this thing cuts. One thing I will say about these Han Dynasty DAO, these little ones, they're sort of 24-inch blades, and they're super convenient and easy to wear. And if your primary weapon is you know, a bow or a spear or whatever, that you practically don't even notice they're there. They're very, very convenient and easy to wear, and particularly the ring pommel at the top. It's interesting. It just kind of assists in this not being a hassle. It gives a good, nice big surface area for if things bump against it, or you know, nothing's going to catch on it and stuff like that. So actually, very convenient little things. Let's try a little bit of cutting with it. Very nice and clean, smooth edges, no ripping. Yeah, surprisingly easy despite the fact it's only a small and pretty narrow blade. Yeah, again, so from the reverse side, completely easy, clean through, very little resistance at all. Right, let's try with a little bit of wood now. I've got some wood that's not quite green wood. It was cut a few weeks ago, so it might be quite dry. We'll see how it goes. So actually fairly clean through about 80%, and then the final 20% snapped off. That almost got all the way through, surprisingly. So you can see there, hopefully. I guess that was about 70–80% of the way through. Nice clean cut, but just not quite all the way through. What I will say, so this is drier wood than I normally cut. What I will say is it's very solid in the hand. I'm really surprised because such a small blade. I mean, not only is it short, it's quite narrow, although it is quite a thick spine. It feels a lot more solid in the cut than I would have expected. I would have expected more feedback to my hand, more objection in my hand, just given how light and small this is, like 400 and something grams. So I'm surprised actually. It cuts with a lot of authority for the size. So although that didn't go all the way through, it went surprisingly far through on the thick part. You can see there. Pretty impressive cut. Let's try another one. Wowza, that almost got all the way through. And that is a, you know, look at the size compared to my hand. That is a fairly substantial branch. Pretty impressive. Nice clean cut as well. Let's snap that off there, and let's have another try on this bit. So it did it. I thought it was able to. So clean the way through there. See the size compared to my thumb and hand. It did split a bit of the wood on the back, but really bark, if anything. Not really much to speak about. Very impressive cut, considering the size of this thing. So I'm going to have another go, one more final go, I think, on this same end of wood. Pretty thick, probably around an inch. Let's have another try. There we go. It's a good one to finish on. 100%. This the wood is slightly thin. I have to admit, it's as I'm going down the stick. Obviously, there's a thin end and a thick end, so it's slightly thinner here. But still, a good amount of wood. 100% clean cut right the way through there. You can see the size compared to my hand. This is dry as well. This isn't green wood, and there is really quite a difference. This is much harder. This has been dead for probably a month actually, or chopped off for a month. So completely clean, almost no, just a tiny bit of little fraying at the back there, but almost nothing. Very impressive. And the main thing that surprised me is how solid this feels in the hand. So just to sum up briefly, yet again, LK Chen have impressed and surprised me. This little sword, which has only got about a 24-inch blade, is really a surprisingly good cutter for its size and its weight. I mean, this thing's super light. I think it's less than 500 grams, it's 400 and something grams. It's a small, quickly maneuverable, easily concealable, easily wearable, one-handed little sword that weighs very, very little, about the same as a sort of like a fencing foil or a modern fencing épée. And yet it cuts really impressively, enough to take certainly, you know, limbs off and stuff like this. So very impressive. It's a testament to the design. Obviously this is a one-to-one replica, so it's a testament to the original Han Dynasty DAO design. And there are a few other things I noticed about this, and the two things that I'm really walking away from that test cutting with are firstly how solid it felt. Usually when you cut solid targets like wood with something that's quite small, your body absorbs quite a lot of the shock of that impact, because this is a small light object, so this can't absorb much impact. But it went through so well, it was so efficient that I didn't really feel it. It didn't feel like hitting a hard object with a light object. It felt like using a bigger, heavier sword than it actually is once it made that impact. That's the first thing. So it cut with a lot of authority for its very lightweight and very small size and narrow blade. But the other thing that surprised me was this disc pommel. And very often when you cut with swords, even if you practice them with in air and they feel comfortable like that, when you actually start hitting hard objects with them, you often find that bits of the hilt offend your hand in ways you didn't expect. Sometimes the guard rubs on your hand, sometimes the pommel rubs on your hand, sometimes the pommel hurts your hand with the impact. But with this, I didn't get any of that. I didn't have any issues with the guard or bolster, hand stop, whatever you want to call it at the top. My hand didn't really interact with that at all. My hand, because I was cutting and not thrusting, did slide down towards the pommel and didn't go up towards the guard at all. Again, because I was cutting and not thrusting, and I didn't do any thrusting tests, I'm aware of that. But there was no issue with the pommel whatsoever, and the pommel was actually very comfortable against my hand. And I do feel where the pommel has been interacting with my hand, but there's no bruising, there's no rubbing, nothing. So actually that pommel, for its amazing lightweight, was a very efficient way of making something that keeps my hand on the weapon, keeps it in my hand, super important in a fight, but didn't add much weight, and really, kept my hand snug and secure and comfortable in place. So there we go. Pommel, very impressed. Overall construction, very impressed. Cutting ability for its size and weight, very impressed. It's not, a sword of this size is never going to cut as well as some certain bigger, longer, heavier swords, of course, but for its size and weight, it really cut well enough. Anyway, thank you for watching. Give us a like and a subscribe. Check out the link to LK Chen's website below with the link to this sword, and you can see the other things they sell as well. I hope that's been interesting. As always, I'm always interested to read your comments and feedback, so comment below, leave a hi, or leave some observation on this sword or other Chinese swords or Chinese history. Feel free to correct me if I pronounced something wrong or said something that was slightly incorrect. That's welcome as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you really soon again for another video or a review or something else related on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Cheers folks!